Today I'm visiting the town of Eskilstuna and I'm gonna find out more about murderous saints and medieval smithies. And I'm also gonna visit a runestone that gave inspiration for Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. I've made a couple of videos about cities in Sweden, and the time has now come to visit the town of Eskilstuna. The problem is that Eskilstuna is actually a pretty small town, but I have a feeling that I'm gonna find some interesting spots here anyway. In 2016, Eskilstuna was the 15th biggest city in Sweden, but it's now fallen to place 19. Around 70,000 people live in the city itself, and a bit over 100,000 in the municipality. Despite being a small town, Eskilstuna has a long history and many surprising pieces of information. The biggest pop/rock band in Sweden, Kent, comes from Eskilstuna, and the oldest music academy in Sweden can be found here as well. And the name of the town actually comes from a murderous saint who came to Sweden to kill Vikings. More than 1,000 years ago, there were two towns where Eskilstuna is today, Tuna and Fors. In the 1100s, the town of Tuna became the center for a religious cult surrounding Saint Eskil. It's believed that Saint Eskil died in 1080, and he was mentioned in the legend of Knut the Holy that was written in 1120 as Eskilinus, a noble bishop from England. He apparently came to Sweden to kill a lot of barbaric Svear and Götar, basically different tribes of Vikings and Proto-Swedes. Eventually, Eskil was killed by heathens who weren't too impressed by his way of spreading Christianity, but after that he was made into a saint. And the people of Tuna really liked Saint Eskil. By the late 1100s, Tuna was still called Tuna, but sometime before 1266 the name of the town changed to Eskilstuna, after the saintly bishop from England who came here to kill heathens. Eskilstuna even has a beach. This man-made beach is called Miami Nice. Or wait, it's probably just his food stand that's called Miami Nice, not the beach itself. Wakeboarding in September? I don't think so. Eskilstuna used to be a small town in the Middle Ages, even smaller than today, and the center of that town was right here in Gamla staden, the old town. In early medieval times, this street was called Long Street, but later on it changed name to Merchant Street. You can see a lot of old buildings here, such as the old theater and Fors kyrka, the Fors Church. Fors Church was built in the middle of the 1100s by Saint Eskil that I mentioned earlier, and it's the oldest church in town. The church was rebuilt in the 1400s and the 1600s, but parts of it are actually intact from the 1100s. That makes it one of the most significant medieval monuments in the city. But let's talk about some other historical places in Eskilstuna. A bit outside of Eskilstuna you find Sundbyholm Castle. In the Middle Ages there was a monastery here, but in 1527 the king confiscated the land. That was during the Reformation, at a time when the power of the church was greatly diminished and when the crown seized a lot of church property. In the 1600s, the castle was rebuilt and expanded, and Admiral Gyllenheim, who was the owner, also had a school built. It was actually one of the first public schools in Sweden. In 1939, the state bought Sundbyholm Castle, and these days it's a hotel and a place for companies to have conferences in a beautiful location. Apparently there is a real beach here in Eskilstuna as well, but I want to show you something else here in Sundbyholm. Let's take a little walk. A 10-minute walk from the castle, you can find Sigurdsristningen, the Sigurd Carving. This is one of the most impressive Viking runestones in Sweden, and it dates back to sometime around 1000 AD. In the Icelandic tales of Snorri's Edda, you can read about Sigurd Fafnirsbane, and this runestone shows images from that story. First we see Sigurd sitting naked and cooking the heart of the dragon Fafnir that is slain. He's cooking it for his foster father Regin, who is Fafnir's brother. And it's a bit of a spoiler, but the one without a head in the corner, that's Regin. While cooking the heart, he gets some of the dragon's blood in his mouth, and then suddenly he can speak to birds. For some reason. Some birds in the tree nearby tell Sigurd that Regin won't keep his promise and that he will kill him, so Sigurd decides to retaliate first. He cuts the head off Regin, and thus the headless body in the corner. And we can also see Regin's smithing tools, as well as the sword Gram and a horse that Sigurd is loading full with treasure. We also see a flashback to Sigurd slaying Fafnir down here. The Vikings hadn't really learned how to tell a story visually. It's all a bit of a jumbled mess, but it's still extremely interesting. This is basically a visual novel from more than 1,000 years ago that was inspiration for both The Ring of Nibelung as well as Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Let's keep forward in time to the year 1659. That's the year when Eskilstuna got its city privileges, even if it's a bit of a convoluted mess. Tuna was the town on the eastern side of the river, but there was another town called Fors nearby. However, by 1659 it was called Carl Gustav's town instead, and that's actually the city that got its city privileges. Around that time there was a lot of smithies here. Eskilstuna, or rather Carl Gustav's town, was famous for its fine handicraft. These houses are called the Radaker Smithies, and they're an open-air museum showing off how smithing looked here in the 1600s and the 1700s. And they're also showing off a lot of other handicraft, and apparently there's a restaurant and a cafe as well. Reinhold Rademacher was a manufacturer who had smithies in Latvia, but the Swedish king was worried about the close proximity to Russia. The king convinced Rademacher to move his smithies here instead, to Eskilstuna. As an added incentive, Rademacher got exclusive rights on creating fine smithy items, like scissors, nails and hinges. In the summers there's a lot of activities here, especially for kids who get to try what it was like to work in the smithies. I'm not saying that that's a thinly veiled attempt at introducing child labor in Eskilstuna, but I'm not saying that it isn't. One area of Eskilstuna is called Staden, the Munktell town. In the 1800s, Johan Munktell set up a mechanical workshop here, and Eskilstuna started to be transformed into an industrial town. In 1853, Munktell built Sweden's first steam locomotive here, and eventually Munktell became part of the Volvo corporate group. If you're interested in 19th century manufacturing, there's a museum here called the Munktell Museum. Personally, I find the architecture more interesting. There's something extremely charming about these huge red tile buildings. These days, this area has been transformed from a place of industries to a place of events and culture. There's a sports arena here, and music events and theater and a lot more. You can also rent kayaks and stand-up paddleboards here. But that's just for the summer months. I'm not hopping in this freezing water today. Speaking of hopping into water, there's also a bathhouse called Munktellbadet here. For some reason, the city seems really proud of this bathhouse. It was built in 2016, and it is one of the world's most modern bathhouses. But in the end, it is just a bathhouse. It's not a tourist destination, despite the city's tourism pages trying to tell you differently. Something very odd and also very cool in Eskilstuna is Retuna Återbruksgalleria. It's basically a mall filled with refurbished things you can buy. Everything for sale has been cleaned up and repaired, but it's all second-hand stuff. But I hope that this chocolate and these sesame bars aren't second-hand. This place opened in 2015, and by 2020 they had a turnover of 15.4 million Swedish crowns, so it seems like people appreciate this environmentally friendly mall. Eskilstuna is trying to do a lot for the environment, but then again that's true for all of Sweden, so it's nothing special for this town. But on the other hand, I can't say that I've ever seen anything quite like this second-hand mall. Parkin Zoo is, a zoo in Eskilstuna that started in 1898 as a public park. In the 1950s they added the zoo section, and in the 1980s they also added a small theme park section. Between 1986 and 2009, the theme park section was called the Phantom Land, after the comic book character The Phantom. Unfortunately, they changed the theming after that. I was here in 2010 and I had to sit on a cheese throne instead of the majestic skull throne. What a disappointment. And something that's even more disappointing is all the critique that Parkin Zoo has received throughout the years. In 2006, a worker at the zoo was killed when he was hit by a roller coaster car. And in 2012 and 2013, the park was accused of unnecessarily killing off animals instead of, for example, transferring them to other locations. It's also been debated whether or not the park has broken laws when it comes to how they handle endangered species. And unfortunately, the problems haven't stopped there. In 2020, 5 lion cubs were born here, and they were no longer alive in 2021. The park declined to respond to an animal rights organization regarding what had happened. Right now, there's a lot of pressure on zoos and theme parks in Sweden. Many people are advocating boycotts of zoos. Keeping animals in captivity is simply inhumane and not worthy of a progressive society. Personally, I think that some zoos are trying to do a good job at least, and they're doing their best to keep the animals healthy and happy. And while captivity is always bad for an animal, there have been some species that have been helped by breeding programs at zoos. I think that that's a subject that takes a lot more time to dig into though, and it's not really the topic of this video. And there you have it. That was a quick look at the town of Eskilstuna, named after a Viking killing saint. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day. Now check out this video for even more weird and wonderful things about Sweden.